Attention! This makes absolutely no sense. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Zander's Facts.
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome into Zander's Facts. I am, of course, the aforementioned Zander, and no, this is not a new episode of the Zander's Facts podcast. This week,
So sad.
we have got an all-new Zander's Facts Flashback. For the first part of August, Zander's taking a little vacation from the podcast, but we still got some Zander's Facts Flashbacks to turn out for you in case you're missing some important topics, like the one we're talking about this week, which I'm going to introduce in just a second. But before I do that, remember that if you liked the facts on all the previous Zander's Facts podcasts, and you think you're going to like the facts on this week's Zander's Facts podcast, remember to click the follow button on this podcast, this episode, the Zander's Facts Flashback. Remember to download this podcast, the Zander's Facts Flashback. Remember to rate the podcast, review the podcast, go on all your socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I may be taking a vacation from the podcast, but not from social media. Zander's Facts, that's Zander with a Z. And most importantly, remember to tell your friends. Spread the facts! Zander's Facts Podcast. Listen to any of our past episodes, including last week, episode 72. I had our Zander's Facts soccer analyst Emma Adams on. We previewed the club soccer season. The Premier League begins this weekend on Friday. Oh my gosh. It is going to be good. You gotta watch it. And you may not understand, but you probably will if you listen to episode 72 and you hear our preview of all the top 5 leagues in Europe for soccer, including the Premier League. So you should go check that out.
Spitting the truth.
And you should also check out Zander's Weekend Facts, which is still coming out every Sunday morning, our newsletter on Substack, which is linked in this episode's description. Check that out, and the link tree has all the Zander's Facts links that you need, including for the YouTube channel. Last week, episode 72 came out on YouTube, and this Zander's Facts Flashback is coming out on YouTube too. So check out Zander's Facts on YouTube. So now that I got all that stuff out of the way, I'm going to introduce our Zander's Facts Flashback for this week, which is episode 55 from back in March of this year. We are talking about Ukraine. We haven't talked about Ukraine in a while on this podcast, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war, is still going on. Ukraine has survived for now. The fighting is mostly in the eastern part of the region, and from when we were talking about this back in March, a lot has changed. But the origins of this war in Ukraine are interesting, fascinating, and you probably should learn about them if you haven't. If you haven't listened to episode 55. This episode is when I introduced a new special guest, brand new special guest to the Zander's Facts podcast, Dr. Bobby, who is an expert on basically Russia, Eastern Europe, like all this stuff. He knows what he's talking about, and he knew what he was talking about on episode 55, which is about the beginnings of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was back in March. So some of the stuff probably is going to be outdated, but the beginnings, the origins, are stuff you need to know about. So here we go. This week, it's episode 55 we are going back to on this Zander's Facts Flashback.
Zander's Facts.
Zander's Facts Podcast, we are continuing on the podcast here on episode 55 with a brand new Zander's Facts guest. We have got Dr. Bobby. He is the director of the Russian program at Virginia Tech. Dr. Bobby, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Zander. Good to be here.
Well, the thing we're going to talk about is definitely not good. We've got some serious stuff to talk about going on over in Ukraine. As you all probably know by now, Russia has invaded Ukraine. And this is the things that we're seeing are sad. They're terrible. It's just awful. But I brought in Dr. Bobby to, basically describe what's going on over there because he can do it a lot better than I can.
Duh.
So first question I've got for you, Dr. Bobby, is basically just an overview. Why is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, invading Ukraine right now?
Well, right now, I think he actually saw an opportunity. I think he considers the West, Western Europe, and the United States at a particularly weak point. And I think he also thought that time might have been running out as far as, expanding the Russian sphere of influence. And I think that is probably, as to the question why, that is probably why this is taking place, is, an expansion of the Russian sphere of influence. I know they're, throwing a lot of words around about, restoring the Russian Empire, restoring the Soviet Union and things like that. There is a bit of a 19th century mentality, actually even more of a colonialist, imperialist mentality going on here. But really, I think what it boils down to more than anything else is trying to expand the Russian sphere of influence, trying to regain, I think, what Putin and a lot of Russians think was lost with the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s.
Yeah, and you said Putin thought that the West was weak and probably wouldn't unify against him, but that has not been the case so far. I think he probably thought especially the U.S. was at a weak point with everything that's been going on, but that's not what has happened. They've been unified against Russia right now.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think that was probably pretty surprising. Probably the most surprising in this sphere would be the very strong reaction of Germany, and probably to a lesser extent, France. The Nord Stream pipeline, it was almost immediately canceled, or at least, put on indefinite hold by Germany almost as soon as this started. And I think that was probably something that was a little bit unexpected. Unfortunately, it looks too like the Russian government has dug itself into a bit more of a hole here with this. On the one hand, they're very concerned to show a lot of strength. However, the more they do this, the more this becomes, more of an atrocity. It's difficult to see how it would be more of an atrocity than it already is. You're attacking a neighbor on completely false pretenses. The more this happens, the more this demonstration of strength tries to go, the more the West is going to be united against it. And probably the more likely it is that Putin and the Russian government are going to lose I wouldn't necessarily call it support, but at least the tacit support of China on this, and become further and further isolated.
Yeah, so we're going to get more onto what the West is doing, the sanctions, what effects those are going to have in a minute. But I wanted to ask you about Putin, because there's been a lot of news about, or, you've seen in the speeches he's given, he's seemed angrier. So how has his demeanor changed, if at all, over the last few weeks?
Well, actually, over the last few weeks, I think it's been pretty consistent. However, if you look back over the last few years, and certainly over the last 22 years since he's been in power, there does seem to be a marked change in what is going on. I know that a lot of the American and European commentators have talked about, the distance he is obviously keeping from other world leaders, not only other world leaders, but even members of his own Security Council. He's essentially talking to them from across long tables. There was a shot from the Russian media yesterday of him talking with Lavrov, his foreign minister. And, it looks like they're about 25 feet away from each other. Now, this is something very different. I'm sure it's related to COVID and perhaps some kind of COVID paranoia. But essentially, the way a lot of Russian offices are set up, there will be the desk of whoever is in charge with a table that comes out of it in sort of like a T shape. And this is how Putin used to conduct a lot of his meetings. That has definitely changed, and it does seem to reflect him being more of an isolated leader in this sense. I don't know how much of this is for show. I think a lot of the things he's been doing in his speeches and in his meetings lately have been completely for show. But it's definitely something that a lot of people are taking note of. I think the biggest difference is this calm, cool, collected, and calculating Vladimir Putin that we've, sort of been used to over the last 22 years or so has really changed. And I think last Monday in his обращение, his speech to the country, and again, it's difficult to tell who this audience was. Obviously it was partially, at least for Ukraine. It became extremely menacing, threatening, and more than I've, seen before, almost snarling. in its denunciation of Ukraine, the Ukrainians. At that point, it was obvious that the invasion was a done deal and it was going to commence within hours. That's just not something that we've really seen before.
Yeah, and when he was making that speech, a big term that was thrown out that he said was denazify, which is obviously ridiculous because the president of Ukraine is Jewish and had family members who died in the Holocaust. So, what did he mean by that? Is he like trying to justify this war, or does it mean something else?
Yeah, the word is extremely charged it's extremely charged anywhere, but especially in Russia. The use of this, calling the people in Kiev fascisti, fascists, Nazis, neo-Nazis, this isn't very new. I mean, this pretty much went all over the place, went viral in the Russian government language and the Russian state media ever since Maidan, the uprisings back in 2014 that eventually ousted the Moscow-backed president of Ukraine. So from that perspective, this word is not necessarily very new, but using it like this, in combination with terms like genocide, one of the main claims and probably the strongest justification he's using toward, for the Russian people to try and accept this, is that there was a genocide of Russian speakers, ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine. This is also the reason for the recognition of the Donbass breakaway republic in Ukraine and the Lugansk breakaway republic, as actual countries. Farcical as this was, this really might have been like the first shot going out. Now, World War II in Russia and the Soviet Union was far more devastating than it was in the West. They lost upwards of 20 million people, probably around 24 million or 25 million. This is also something that exists in the national psyche as a great source of pride. It's almost natural that he would start describing the people that he is going to put forth as enemies as Nazis. We're getting this in the West too. It's certainly not just the Ukraine. He sees the Ukrainian regime as a puppet regime installed by fascists from the West as well. This also kind of ties into the description of NATO. The argument against NATO, and it's not an illegitimate argument, is that this expansion of NATO from the West to the East is supposed to be mirroring the attacks from Germany in the 20th century, and to a certain extent even the attack of Napoleon back in 1812, where Russia is threatened from the West by an expanding West. The term Nazi is guaranteed to get the Russians up in arms. To the extent to which they believe this, however, is a different matter. I think pretty much every Russian who knows anything about international affairs knows that Zelensky is Jewish.
Mm-hmm. So that's what I wanted to ask you about the Russian people. How do they feel about this invasion? Because most of what they can, experience is, blatant Russian propaganda. But you've still got the internet and Twitter and stuff like that where you can, find Western sources and outlets. But what is the overall mentality of the Russian people towards this invasion?
This is a little bit hard to tell. The demonstrations we've seen up to this point have been pretty strong. Russian state media is towing the line. Looking at it this morning, though, there seem to be maybe a couple of different cracks coming in, as if they're not necessarily even believing their own reporting. As you probably know, they are not allowed to use the word war to describe what's going on here. You can use it in different contexts and things like that, but you cannot use it to describe what's happening in the Ukraine. It is a special operation. You cannot use the word vторжение, invasion. This is something that is just completely taboo at this point, despite the fact that pretty much everybody knows what it is. However, the state media is concentrating, I wouldn't say completely, but almost completely on what is happening in the eastern Ukraine. They are trying to focus on supposed atrocities committed by Ukrainian forces in Donetsk and Lugansk, to the exclusion of just about everything else. Kyiv is barely being mentioned at all. And when it is, it's, the fact that there are these fascists in Kyiv who are, dictating these atrocities against the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. This is being put forth as the justification. To the extent that people believe this, I've got to think that faith in this is deteriorating, probably rapidly, given the extent to which we've seen the protests, as well as the things that the independent media is reporting in Russia. Honestly, the way things are going right now, I think the clock is ticking on Dost, the independent television network, and Novaya Gazeta, another independent media outlet and newspaper. They are being pretty careful about what they say, but they're covering many of the same things that the Western media is. The further this sinks into brutality, I think, and it's looking to do that within the next few hours, if not days, the more they're going to have to crack down on any dissent. And I think this is probably where, if anywhere, this whole invasion is really going to backfire.
This is a fact.
So I wanted to transition from in Russia to Ukraine. We're recording this on Tuesday morning, and it appears as though right now the Russian army is encircling the capital of Kyiv and Kharkiv, which is right on the border with Russia. And you just said as of Tuesday morning, it looks like this is about to get much worse. How has Ukraine's army been holding up so far? And they've been protecting Kyiv so far, but how much longer can they do that if Russia just keeps bringing in resources?
I don't think I'm a military expert, but I definitely did not expect them to hold out this long. I expected Kiev to fall within days. Much more surprising, though, is what's happening in Kharkiv in Ukrainian. This was something that I really would have expected to fall within the first day or two, given its proximity to Russia, given how close Russian artillery already was to it. I thought this was going to collapse pretty quickly. As of right now, it still hasn't. So, you have to think that Ukrainian forces, whether they're, the regular Ukrainian army or just citizens with AKs, has acquitted itself amazingly well. It is far different than what anybody expected. And I think certainly far different than what Putin expected. That said, it's obvious that they are going to, I think, try to make up for their mistakes. And I think they're going to do it in an extremely brutal way. We saw this missile attack on a government building in Kharkiv. This actually comes on the heels of what seems to have been cluster bombs being used yesterday. This is a munition that is banned in most countries. It's an incredibly cruel device, and of course it looks like they're also moving in thermobaric munitions as well. Whether or not the Russian forces are going to go in and, just completely flatten the cities, I think remains to be seen. It really is, it's a worst case scenario for everybody, including the Russians, if they do that. If it happens, I don't really see them, holding out for more than a week. Now, the cities fall, the government falls if they're to arrest Zelensky. I don't see this ending by any means. The Ukrainians have a history of partisan warfare, and I would expect it to continue, at least resistance in some form of varying strengths for quite some time.
That's what I was going to ask you. If Russia does take Kyiv, what is likely to happen? Are they going to install a puppet government? And how are the Ukrainian people going to respond to that?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt about that. They would certainly install a puppet government. They definitely want to go back to the pre-2014 status quo as far as Ukraine goes. I would expect, at least I would have earlier expected there to be a Ukrainian government in exile set up. But it's obvious at this point that there is going to be a very strong Ukrainian resistance. There's really no doubt about it. One of the things which I think surprised a lot of Western observers, as well as, the Russian authorities, which actually should not have come as much of a surprise, is the motivation that the Ukrainians feel as far as defending their country. It is worth pointing out that they are not strangers to Russian aggression. They're actually not strangers to genocidal acts against them coming obviously from Nazi Germany in the 1940s, but from Moscow. One of the things that isn't really being mentioned too much in the media is the Holodomor, the engineered famine of 1932 and 1933, where around 4 million Ukrainians died. Basically, were starved to death, by Stalinist Moscow as a way to finally crush any Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian resistance to Soviet power. We don't see anything on that scale, yet. And I don't think it's going to quite, hit that extent. But, the Ukrainians have not forgotten this, even if the Russians have.
So we talked about how the West has united behind Ukraine, and they have sanctioned Russia. They've sanctioned their economy. They've sanctioned Putin personally. And, that's caused the Russian economy to crash. The stock market has gone way down. The ruble has crashed. So what effect are these sanctions from the US and the UK and European Union, those countries, are they going to have on the Russian economy now and potentially later?
Well, the bigger effects are going to be felt later. The increasing isolation from the global financial system is going to hit Russia very hard. Now, it will probably hit Putin a little bit less, but if it can hit the oligarchs, upon whom his support really depends, I think that may change things. By and large, though, I'm not really certain that the sanctions are going to have a much larger effect. I do think, though, at least the financial sanctions, closing European airspace to Russian planes, further isolating this country, actually, I think is going to be just as strong as, taking them out of the SWIFT system. And remember, this is not completely, it is not something that they have done full scale, at least not yet. I think more at issue, and I think the question that's probably going to be coming up in the coming weeks, if this really does turn into, I hate to say it, but really a crime against humanity, which, to a certain extent it already is, shutting off Russian natural gas and oil. At this point, that hasn't happened. And I don't know that there's necessarily going to be much of a stomach for it, at least in the United States, which is probably too bad. But I think this would make things much more painful, and I think have a much stronger and probably more immediate effect, regular financial sanctions.
Is there anything else the US, the West could do besides that could actually harm Russia and could be, act as a deterrent to stop Russia right now?
Well, yeah, really the best thing, and I'm definitely a pacifist. I am not in favor of, war in just about any circumstance, but almost the best thing we could do is keep getting them Stinger missiles and the Javelin anti-tank weapons
to Ukraine.
Yeah. It's going to be a difficult task, but I think, the United States has been able to do this in situations where it has been, even more difficult before. I have to think that, the Ukrainian military is getting quite a bit of advice, from the Pentagon. Looking at these long columns of Russian vehicles stretching towards Kiev. I'm sure that in the Pentagon, they are just, licking their chops at this kind of target, and trying to find a way for the Ukrainians to be able to hit that. This, for all the talk that Putin was making about Ukraine somehow being an existential threat to Russia, ridiculous as that was, these vehicles are an existential threat to Ukraine, certainly Ukrainian sovereignty. I think military advisors, weapons, even if we cannot put personnel on the ground, is going to be very important for what happens in the coming days.
All right. So finally, I just wanted to ask you, what is the end game here? What is Putin trying to do? Could he potentially attack NATO, cyber attacks on NATO, any of that? Well, actually, with cyber attacks on NATO, what response would come from NATO from that, actually, first off?
Well, yeah, first off, I'm surprised we haven't seen these already. And, I'm not an expert in this field, so I don't really know if they are holding something in reserve or if they've been blocked. Russia has a vaunted cybersecurity department, and they are definitely capable of taking out cyber attacks. They've done so in Ukraine before. Oddly, though, the lights are on. Internet is working, much to the detriment of the Russian military. The Ukrainian authorities are scoring propaganda victories almost every 5 minutes through social media. How Russia has not shut that down, I don't understand. I don't know if they've been blocked or they're holding something in reserve. Could and would they cyber attack NATO? Yes, definitely. And I'm sure the responses will be, to sort of steal the rhetoric that's coming out of the American government, proportional. The end game, though, is really difficult to see. I don't really know if the country is going to be divided up, if Russia is going to sort of like stop on the eastern side of the Dnieper River or to expand all the way to the west. I would assume at this point that they'll probably try to subjugate the entire country. They probably expected to do this already. Once that stops, it's sort of a minor detail to it, but I would also imagine that they would take Moldova, at least to the east of the Dniester River in Transnistria, which the so-called authorities there would be essentially begging to be returned to Russia. The Russian army is already there, so that would not be a stretch. Belarus has already established itself as a client state. And, they're going to fall further and further under the thrall of Moscow. Further east, Kazakhstan has actually been a little bit surprising. I think they were asked to send troops to this. Russia sent troops to Kazakhstan right around December and early January when they were having uprisings there to try and quell the uprisings. Thus far, Kazakhstan has not responded in kind. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens over there. As far as attacking NATO, this is probably the scariest question of all. We saw how, I think it was the day before yesterday, that Putin made a big show of putting, the nuclear forces on alert. This actually, to sort of, sidetrack this for a little bit, this was a very, very interesting and strange move. It's unclear really to me who this was for. It had to be for the domestic audience. If he were to put his nuclear forces on alert and not say anything, we would know right away. So, it would not necessarily be a secret other than to the Russian people, probably. But he wants them to know that this is what he's doing. He probably also wants, people in Western Europe and the United States to know that he has this nuclear saber and he is rattling it very, very loudly. How this affects the rest of NATO is, I guess, kind of an open question. Putin is well aware and has admitted as such that, a conventional war against NATO would go very badly for Russia. Russia could not stand up to a war or, any kind of assault coming from Western Europe. It's just, he knows this, and thus all of the nuclear posturing. I'd seen estimates, though, that, in the Baltics, he could be in Riga probably within 36 hours, the capital of Latvia. Vilnius, the capital of Ukraine, probably much sooner. It's
capital of Lithuania.
I'm sorry, Lithuania. Probably much sooner. It's actually much, much closer to the borders than either Tallinn in Estonia or Riga in Latvia. There are sizable Russian populations there. It would be easy for him to transfer the excuse that he's been using to invade Ukraine over to the Baltic states. It would be very easy, especially in a town like Narva, which is, you can literally see Russia from Narva. It is right across the river, and it is filled with Russian speakers. Whether or not this would happen, I have to doubt it. That would be World War III.
Uh-oh.
And that really would be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, because Putin knows, because if he attacked or troops came into the Baltics, or, if he takes Ukraine, Poland is right there too. If he did that, Article 5 of NATO would be triggered, and it wouldn't just be Western Europe, it would be the United States too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I mentioned Moldova too. Moldova is not part of NATO. Not that he would necessarily have to invade all of Moldova, but Transnistria right there, once Ukraine falls, Transnistria would be returned to the Ukraine. I mean, that is like the first move that I see happening. An invasion of Poland, I really don't think is in the cards, at least not within the foreseeable future. But then again, a month ago, I told a friend of mine that I just don't see Russia invading. I mean, it was really, I think, about maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago that, it looked like this was inevitable. And as the rhetoric, really amped up, it became a near certainty. Speaking of this rhetoric too, there's another point, at least in the Russian media, that has really kind of been disturbing lately, at least as far as, the conduct of the war goes. They are concentrating, as I said before, mostly on what's happening in the East. They're using words like освобождение, liberation, that they are liberating these towns and these cities and these people from, a tyrannical Ukrainian regime. We talked about Nazis before. This is the same vocabulary that they were using as the Soviet army was marching west towards Berlin, liberating places that used to be under the Nazi thumb. Now, liberation was very much a relative term. I mean, you were trading the Nazis for, the Stalinist regime, but this is what's happening right now too. So one would have to think that they are going to push further and further west, to ostensibly liberate people from the tyranny that they see going on there.
Good to know.
All right. Well, Dr. Bobby, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for explaining this whole situation a lot better than I can. It's definitely ongoing. So hopefully be able to have you back to talk about this once again. But thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yep, it's definitely a fluid situation. Thanks for having me on here.
Zander's Facts.
And there you have it. That is this week's Zander's Facts Flashback. Dr. Bobby, that was his first appearance on the podcast. He's been on the podcast also more recently. You should check out those episodes of the podcast where he talks about Ukraine. And you should also just check on the news, because a lot more stuff has happened regarding that situation in the months since, because we're in August now, so things have changed. But that's this week's Zander's Facts Flashback. Thank you all for listening, and remember, if you liked all the facts that we had on the Zander's Facts Flashback, remember to click the follow button on this podcast, download this episode, rate and review the podcast, go on all your socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Zander's Facts, that's Zander with a Z, and most importantly, remember to tell all your friends. Spread the facts! Zander's Facts Podcast. Remember to check out Zander's Facts on YouTube, because this flashback is going on YouTube. Check that out. Zander's Facts. Search it. Look it up. Watch. Be happy. Check out the Zander's Facts link tree. It's got all the Zander's Facts links that you need for social media, for YouTube, for this podcast, and for Zander's Weekend Facts, which you should check out every Sunday morning. Those are still coming out in August every Sunday morning. Check out Zander's Weekend Facts in the link in this episode's description. But that is the Zander's Facts Flashback. We are returning with the Zander's Facts podcast in a couple of weeks. So next week, we're going to have another Zander's Facts Flashback, but it is going to be a topic that you are going to want to check out. I'm pretty sure of it. So there you go. That is it. That is a wrap on this Zander's Facts Flashback. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back with a new Zander's Facts Flashback next week.
Cool facts, bro.